Hello and welcome to the Politics Show in the North West. Coming up, they're supposed to be there for us in times of trouble. So who's going to help the Citizens Advice Bureau when the going gets tough? Well, we're at the Three Sisters Recreation Area in Ashton in Makerfield. It's a beautiful spring-like day and lots of people are out and about enjoying the sunshine. Well, the fresh air might be free, but for more and more of us, we're struggling financially and could get into difficulties. And this is where the Citizens Advice Bureau has always been able to help. But as Jill Dummigan reports, the charity itself is now beginning to have money worries of its own.
Karen Yates is a woman back from the brink. Some months ago she had a nervous breakdown. She had depression and the debt started to mount up.
Well, I was a mess, you know. I didn't have the will to live, actually. I was accumulating a table full of letters I couldn't open them. I just thought I can't emotionally deal with them as well as everything else.
Karen went to her local Citizens Advice Bureau for help.
They just know who to go to, who to speak to, who's the next man to go to and stuff.
So that must be a big relief to you.
It is. Big weight off my shoulders.
Last year, nearly 900,000 people in this region were helped by the CAB. It relies heavily on highly trained volunteers, and each bureau is a registered charity.
It can be debt, benefits, relationship breakdown, housing problems, consumer law. You never know when you come in what's going to hit you that day, really.
Like most CABs, Salford's biggest contributor is the local council. Then it's the Legal Aid Fund, the local Primary Care Trust and the government's Financial Inclusion Fund. So let's have a look at these funding streams. The Financial Inclusion Fund was going to be scrapped. It's had a reprieve for 1 year. The Primary Care Trusts are going to be scrapped. The Legal Aid Fund could be getting a budget cut of up to £350 million, while £40 million worth of cuts have been announced by Salford City Council. When your main benefactors are facing this sort of squeeze, it's a pretty fair bet that some pain's going to be heading your way.
Most CABs are facing a kind of like perfect storm in terms of funding cuts at the moment.
Salford Council's already announced proposals to slice 14% from what they give.
It's not new to have financial instability in a voluntary sector organisation like ourselves, but this is, as I say, probably the worst it's been for many years.
The upshot is the branch in Earlham and this one in Walkden, where Pam works, will probably have to close.
A lot of them have problems that mean it's difficult for them to go further afield. They either financially have problems and can't afford the bus fare to go elsewhere, or they have mobility problems.
No one from Salford Council was available for interview, but their statement said they had to do the best with the budget available. They wanted to protect frontline services and they were still in negotiations with the CAB. The mounting debt problems, changes in the benefits system and job losses mean services like these are likely to be more in demand than ever. The CAB is the epitome of the volunteer-led big society in action. Yet government budget cuts are ultimately hitting places like these.
It doesn't seem to us that people get that volunteering, that big society is a very costly activity. It's a really quite radical policy, and if it's going to be a reality, it's going to require some serious thinking about serious resources to voluntary sector organisations. Small, modest local charities like ourselves will need support if it's to be made a reality.
Well, I'm joined by Yvonne Fovargue, the Labour MP for Makerfield and former Chief Executive of the Citizens Advice Bureau. So I guess you're well placed to know exactly how important the work is that they do.
That's right. I mean, I started as a volunteer with the Citizens Advice Bureau and ended up Chief Executive at St Helens. And I know how important it is, not just to the millions of people who use the service, but also to the people who volunteer in the service as well.
So what sort of threats do you think they're under? Is there a real threat?
There's a real threat to CAB. Local CAB receive no government funding directly. They're all funded by a mix of sources. So, for example, local authorities are like the foundations and the building blocks.
The Financial Inclusion Fund, we should just say there is a reprieve on that. The government has decided to extend that for a year, so that is good news.
That's right. I highlighted that in Parliament in a debate, and a lot of MPs, cross-party MPs, realise the importance of debt advice, particularly today. So the government have said there will be 27 million for another year.
Is that enough?
It's never enough for debt advice, particularly in the current climate where people are looking at taking reduced hours, they're looking at taking lower paid jobs.
So is this exactly where David Cameron's big society idea comes in then, and the whole service is run by volunteers?
Absolutely not. Volunteers in the CAB need a considerable amount of training and a considerable amount of support. Some of the cases that they see are amongst probably the most heartrending you can believe. They need the support to deal with that, and the way that volunteers work best, and I demonstrated this in my own bureau in St Helens, is when working with a team of dedicated paid specialists who have years of experience and can support the volunteers to take on more and more work. Without those specialists, the volunteers will not take that type of work on.
And there is the threat that the legal aid aspect of the work that the CAB does could be cut as well, is that right?
That's right. Legal aid is an important part of funding for the larger CABs who take referrals quite often from smaller CABs and from other agencies as well. And that funding could go, it's under threat from the consultation, so there'll be no funding for work on debt, benefits, housing up into possession and employment.
So Yvonne, what is the answer? Where does the money come from?
The money has to come from the government to the local authorities in the first instance, and there really should be a statutory duty to fund advice services. Advice services save the state money. It's proved by a report from Citizens Advice nationally that approximately £8 is saved for every person who goes in for benefits advice. For debt advice, it's about £2 up to £3 for every person that goes in, it's saved. And I'd argue that's even more, because the cost to the health service of people suffering from depression because of their debts can be unmeasurable.
Yvonne Fovargue, thank you very much for joining us. Now, another week, another round of council cuts, and over the past few days, more local authorities have been revealing the details of exactly where the axe will fall. Leanne Harper reports.
The week began with Wirral Council announcing almost £50 million of cuts and the loss of 1,100 jobs. But Conservative leader Councillor Jeff Green says the savings have been found while still managing to protect services such as Sure Start and without the need for compulsory redundancies. The budget will be formally set on Tuesday. In Bolton, £41 million of savings have been identified. Among the areas taking the biggest hit will be children's services. Up to 1,500 jobs will also go over the next 2 years. Trafford Council has been praised by the government for its innovative cost-cutting as it set out £22 million of savings for the coming year.
83% of our frontline services will continue to run as they have done in terms of the ability for streets to be swept, for libraries to be kept open, for our refuse service. So residents won't necessarily see a difference there. Where there might be some changes is how the services are provided.
£64 million of cuts in Rochdale will see the departure of the council's chief executive. Roger Ellis has confirmed he'll be taking voluntary redundancy as the authority looks to share the post with a neighbouring council.
Well, Yvonne Fovargue, the MP for Makerfield, is still with me, and every week we hear about more and more local authorities having to make huge cuts and job losses. But we've also heard there from two councils in particular, Wirral and Trafford, that aren't having to make such huge cuts. Why is that, do you think?
I think probably because the cuts are fiercer in the most deprived areas. For example, Wigan already has lost its area-based grant and its working neighbourhood fund mid-year. So those areas of highest deprivation are suffering the deepest cuts.
But doesn't David Cameron have a point that it does seem to be these Labour councils that are making huge amounts of cuts when they could have perhaps been making savings elsewhere, like, for instance, sharing services?
Absolutely not. Wigan's already looking at sharing services. We already have a good group of Greater Manchester councils that are doing that. The problem is that these services are most needed in these areas.
But it does seem strange that somewhere like Wirral can actually say it's going to invest in some frontline services like children's services.
Wirral has less deprivation and has had less money in the past. The Labour government's policy was always to invest in the areas that needed most help, and that's why areas like Wigan, like Bolton, had more money to invest, and you can see the results of that in the new health centres, the playground that we're near at the moment. Those are the areas that are losing the money now.
But do you think that some of these areas, some of these particularly Labour-run ones, were actually perhaps a little too flabby and relied on grants and public sector workers too much in the past?
No. These are the areas that suffered under the Thatcher era. These are the areas that lost whole swathes of industry, like mining, in the 80s. And these are the areas that needed the support to get them back on their feet.
But just with the Citizens Advice Bureaus, the money has to come from somewhere, and it just isn't there at the moment.
I think that's a fallacy, actually, in a lot of ways.
Do you?
In some ways, yes. The cuts are very front-loaded. And that is the problem. There's been no time for local authorities to make strategic decisions because of the front loading of the cuts. There is absolutely no need to cut as fast and as deep. It's just ideological. It isn't, in fact, an economic necessity.
Yvonne Fovargue, once again, thank you very much for joining us today.